usually do this at the end, but I don't want to forget, and I want to get to it. So I want to thank Legal Aid of Nebraska, who provided the funds for the research that I did, along with Dr. Rebeco and Daniela Gonzalez and the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies. What I'm going to present today is really a small part of a larger research project that we're doing. And I'm going to present some of the background on the entire project, and then the results are just going to be the interviews that I was able to conduct last summer. First thing I want to look at is, well, let me talk about a couple things first. So Legal Aid of Nebraska, formerly Nebraska Legal Aid, expanded it used to be their migrant worker program. Now they've changed it from migrant worker to agricultural workers, trying to expand the reach of who they're serving. And so they asked this question of us: what are some of the barriers to agricultural workers accessing them for free legal civil aid? Again, it's only civil cases. And from what I can tell so far, what their lawyers are doing is mostly outreach. Right? They don't have a lot of people coming to them for help for reasons that we'll get into here in a few minutes. One of the things, and one of the reasons for the changes is because there's far fewer migrants now than there used to be even 10 or 15 years ago. I know in western Nebraska specifically, this is where I'm from. I'm from Scottsbluff. In fact, my father was a migrant farmer from Texas that came up to work the sugar beet fields and ended up staying. And that migrant stream to people coming up to work sugar beet fields has almost disappeared because of technology, because of Roundup Ready seeds. They used to put the seeds in a big line, and then they would have, people would come through manually. These were the farm workers, and they would thin out the seeds once they got to a certain height, and then they had to go back numerous times and weed out the fields. They don't need that anymore because there's no weeds because of the Roundup, and they don't have to they don't have to do the thinning because they have tractors that plant seedlings in the ground instead of seeds per se. So a lot fewer migrants, hence the change to the agricultural workers. So again, this research is done by Dr. Doña Rebeco and our graduate assistant, Daniela Gonzalez, myself, and we set out to find out what some of these barriers are. Our main goal is to generate information that will help Legal Aid of Nebraska provide better access to free civil legal aid for agricultural workers in the state. Right? I'll be honest with you, there wasn't that many surprises from the research that I did. So a lot of what I'm going to do today, I think personally is more interesting, is some of the background leading up to really the funding of Legal Aid of Nebraska. So let's start off here with the definition of agricultural work. You see the one on the top from the Department of Agriculture, and that one's just really, I've never seen that definition until a few days ago when I was looking through some of the literature, and it's just way too broad. It's not the definition that Legal Aid of Nebraska uses. It's close, the definition that Legal Aid of Nebraska uses is closer to the one on the bottom. It's really anybody working fields or ranches, but even beyond it, I was kind of surprised myself. It's people working in canneries. I know that previously meat processing was not included, but they're starting to even include meat processing as long as it's fewer than 50 employees, right? There's certain kind of, some of the smaller plants. Some examples of who would be included here is, there's a trout farm in the Panhandle. It's near Harrisburg, it's kind of near Scottsbluff. Those workers would be included. Also in the Panhandle, there's, oh no, not in the Panhandle, in David City, not too far from here, about an hour west of here, there's an egg production facility. Those workers would also be included in terms of agricultural workers. So they're really trying to cast a wide net and represent as many people as they want. Again, Legal Aid of Nebraska wants to serve more people for various reasons. Right? So really looking at, moving to kind of the background of agricultural workers and looking at the plight of agricultural workers, for lack of a better term. Right? Again, I knew this in some sense, but I didn't understand the scope or the details of this. Agricultural workers are not entitled to minimum wage. They are not entitled to overtime. And I'll get to the California legislation here in a second. Right? They're not entitled to workers' comp, at least in the state of Nebraska. This differs by state, but most states do not give them workers' comp. So no minimum wage, no overtime, and really no benefits. Right? These are people that are that I think we should understand are poor, hardworking people from the beginning, and there seems to be all these other kinds of roadblocks put in their way to fulfilling, you know, what we think of as a happy, healthy life. They're not covered under the Wagner Act of 1935. The Wagner Act was the act, so 1935 is the middle of the Depression, and the Wagner Act, for most people, gave you the right to strike, and it bars employers from hiring strike breakers, right? Agricultural workers were exempted from the Wagner Act. So one of the things that will come up again is the power of the ag lobby to get legislators to take say, you know, it's okay, you can do this for all the other workers, but not for agricultural workers. So this goes back quite a way. California recently passed legislation making workers eligible for overtime and for minimum wage, but the minimum wage is still very low. I think it's $9 an hour in California at this time, which in California is low. And the overtime doesn't kick in until they've worked 10 hours or 60 hours in a week, right? So it's not 40 hours and 8 hours like it is for most other people. So they have moved to address some of the shortfalls, but still, from my point of view, have not gone far enough. So agricultural workers are really starting from, you know, kind of from the back. So I asked this, so leading to funding, right, and LSC is Legal Services Corporation. What is Legal Services Corporation? It's an independent nonprofit, right? It's funded by the federal government, and then Legal Services Corporation. From what I understand from, I was on the phone with Milo Lungard, the director of Legal Aid of Nebraska, and he told me that Legal Services Corporation only funds their organization 20% of their funding, but it gets to dictate who they can and cannot help. And this is true across the nation. Regardless of how much funding they get from Legal Services Corporation gets to tell them who they can help and who they can't help. And we see some examples of this during 1995. I'm just trying to, for those of you that are that old, right, to kick in your memory about the 104th Congress, which packed, you know, the contract with America. This was when the Republicans took over. It was the first time they had a majority in Congress since the Depression for like 50 or 60 years. I don't know exactly how far it went back. And they passed the contract with America. Newt Gingrich was kind of their leader at the time. They also, just to get into some context, they passed the Defense of Marriage Act and welfare reform. Okay, what quote welfare reform? Now, I don't want to pick on the Republicans. I want to be very clear here that Bill Clinton, the Republicans passed the legislation, but Bill Clinton signed the legislation, right? So we have plenty of fault and blame to go around here from both parties. What happened with this legislation was Legal Services Corporation lost 30% of its funding, and about 12% nationwide of legal aid offices closed down at that time. So this is important because this is, you know, this is where poor people can go, not all of them do, but where poor people can go to get legal help. Okay, let's see what we have next. So still more background. Legal service. So the Congress passed this legislation. It was signed by Bill Clinton, and here's kind of what part of it said: recipients of Legal Services Corporation's fund can no longer challenge state or federal welfare reform laws. This was big welfare reform in 1996. Again, it's a little bit before a lot of your time. Some of you weren't alive at the time. I know I was, and I remember this. I remember it because Bill Clinton was running for president, and this was an election year stunt. And he said, "Yeah, I feel bad. I signed that legislation, but we're gonna take care of it in the next term." And then other things happened, which I don't need to remind you about. And he was, let's just say he was distracted, and he wasn't able to work on that welfare reform in the next term. But, so here's some of the people that they cannot help, right? Redistricting cases, anything related to abortion, certain aliens. We know that this means immigrants. The only reason I left that word in there is because that's what the legislation says. Otherwise, I wouldn't have used that word. Participating on behalf of persons incarcerated, federal, state, or local, including pretrial detainees, which to my guess, you know, kind of goes against that innocent until proven guilty that many of us believe in. So how are they able to pass these things? Partly because, you know, thinking about a lawyer, thinking about legal representation, it's not something that I know I don't think about that. When I get into trouble, where am I going to find a lawyer? Right? I actually know a couple that usually, I know a couple of lawyers that sue people, right? so I do have something in my back pocket. But again, it's something that I don't think about. Remember, I just want to remind you, I'm only talking about civil cases here, not criminal cases. Lack of funding and different laws and different restrictions are passed, and voters don't really get upset about it because voters don't know about it, right? It's not that people don't care, it's just not out there. It's one of those, many things that are not, that the candidates aren't talking about when they're out stumping. So legislatures reduce funds, and here we have organizations, we go back to the power of the ag lobby, right? And agriculture is 25% of the economy in the state of Nebraska. So that should tell you how powerful it is in Nebraska, but also nationwide. Organizations representing farmers, seafood and poultry processors have persuaded Congress and state legislatures to pass severe restrictions on the ability of legal aid lawyers to represent immigrants. And it's estimated that a lot of the agricultural workers are immigrants. You'll have a slide coming up. The estimation is 60%. That sounds kind of high to me, but I saw that in numerous places in the literature. One of the things when I'm going through this, I'm a little bit slow compared to some people, right? So sometimes it takes time for things to sink into my head. And when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, who in the United States of America, why would anybody want to keep people from getting legal representation? Right? Why would anybody want to do that? And then I thought, oh, the same people that want to keep people from voting in our democracy, right? And then that's why I say I'm kind of slow. It's one of those things that I go, duh, right? This should be kind of obvious, and maybe it's obvious to you. It wasn't obvious to me, at least initially. So many legal aid providers are persistently underfunded and deliberately underfunded. We know that this happens with a lot of government. And again, in a number of places I saw that they turn away one person for every person that they represent. And these are people that are eligible. These are people that meet the guidelines in terms of immigration or citizenship. These are people that meet the income guidelines, which I think it's 125% of the poverty level. If you make less than 125% of the poverty level, they can represent you. Just to give you some idea, the poverty levels now is about $24,000 for a family of four. So you got to make less than $30,000 a year. My point is, you have to be pretty poor for Legal Services for Legal Aid of Nebraska to represent you. And even at that, they can't represent everybody that they should. I remember this respondent, not to get too far ahead, but I remember this respondent in Scottsbluff saying, wow, first she was saying they need to do outreach, and then she followed that up with, if everybody that's eligible goes to Legal Aid of Nebraska, they're going to have their hands full, right? Like it's going to be too many people. We know that in government, that they deliberately plan that everybody eligible for whatever it is, not food stamps anymore, SNAP or Section 8 or whatever it is, that not everybody that's eligible uses those programs, and they count on that, right? So we see on the bottom here, Legal Services Corporation bars recipients in 1980 from representing undocumented workers, and 1983 excluded some legal immigrants. I say legal in quotation marks, such as TPS, H-2B visa holders, asylum seekers, juvenile immigrant youth, and others. I've asked them a couple times, and I've looked through the literature. I'm still a little bit unclear about who they can represent and who they cannot represent in terms of immigrants. I was told that they can. I was told on the phone a couple of days ago that they can represent TPS holders. So this is what the literature said. I was told something different. And part of that is not because they're confused. I'm the one that's confused. It's not because they're confused. It's because it's in flux. It's because who they can and cannot represent differs from sometimes from day to day and week to week. It raises the question, why would anybody think that non-citizens can and should be represented by federal funds, right? And as I say that, I realize the absurdity of that statement, right, of that question. But some people think that way. I'm paying my federal taxes. Guess what? Immigrants pay federal taxes too, right? They pay much more taxes than other people. But the reason why, and the reason why we should be concerned about it is the 14th Amendment. Most of what the 14th Amendment does is grant people born here what we call birthright citizenship, right? A subject of a presentation that was going on last week. But the other thing that it does is the equal representation clause, the equal protection clause, right? And the 14th Amendment specifically says persons. It does not say citizens. And this was something that was hotly debated in 1867, right? This was right after the Civil War. And the Congress was asking, what do we do with all these slaves that are freed now? And what the response was, oh, we make them citizens. If you're born in the physical boundaries of the United States, you're a citizen, right? But also equal protection. So again, it says persons, not citizens. And able comes up and says, those who are subject to the laws of the country should also benefit from the protection of those laws. You're subject to the laws, but yet they're trying to keep people, in terms of putting it back in context of Legal Aid of Nebraska, from having representation at times. So, I'm going to move on. I'm shifting here a little bit to problems with the research itself, right? The original plan, and I realize that 4 agricultural workers and 4 community advocates in 4 areas doesn't add up to 30, right? We figured that we'd lose a few here and there. But originally I planned to interview about 30 people, about 30 ag workers and about 30 community advocates. We chose different areas of the state, not arbitrarily. We chose areas that, since I was going to go out and do the interviews, that I was familiar with, and areas where we thought we'd find large numbers of agricultural workers. So one of the areas, I was born and raised in Scottsbluff, and I still have a lot of connections there. And in fact, a lot of my interviews came from there. That summer I drove back and forth from Omaha to Scottsbluff, like, I want to say 6 times. It was one of the things with doing research. I remember doing my dissertation research in Schuyler. Schuyler was only an hour and 15 minutes. And I remember trying to schedule 2 interviews in the same day, so I didn't have to go back and forth, and it just never worked out. It didn't work out. Actually, there was one trip when I did 2 interviews in one day. But other than that, it was drive to Scottsbluff, do an interview, drive back to Omaha. Drive to Scottsbluff, do an interview, drive back to Omaha. So quite a trip. Scottsbluff was one area. Another area was generally kind of eastern Nebraska, included Lincoln and Omaha and Crete. We also looked at central Lexington, the Lexington area, and then kind of the northeast, really the Schuyler area, but northeast Nebraska. There were some areas, some people in Omaha don't realize this, but Nebraska is a huge state, right? It's 500 miles wide from east to west. And I don't know how much, it's got to be a couple hundred miles from north to south. And so there were some areas like South Sioux City that we just figured we can't reach these areas, right? It's just too vast. Some of the vastness out there. Another thing that we had to do, that we planned on doing, and I'm going to talk about some of the details of this. First was looking at secondary data or survey data. Right? But there was limited survey data because most large data sets didn't have a representative or a good sample from Nebraska, and they had even fewer cases that were agricultural workers in Nebraska. It was even difficult to figure out how many workers there were in the state. I don't remember the numbers and I don't remember the organizations, but it was a difference of, I want to say like thousands of people, the different numbers that these 2 government organizations had. One of them had, off the top of my head, I want to say like 23,000, and the other one had, I don't know, like 2,000 or 3,000. It was a huge, huge difference. Part of that goes on, who they're counting and who they're not counting. Nonetheless, there was not good survey data. Just as an example, there's something called the National Agricultural Workers Survey, but it doesn't have data on a statewide level, except for California. California's got to have hundreds of thousands of ag workers, and it must be a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? So we changed that part of the research and focused on media representation, and we sent a smaller survey out to some community advocates and lawyers. And we've had a moderate success rate with that. We're still in the midst of, I'm not, Dr. Doyle-Ranko's still in the midst of gathering those surveys and analyzing them and getting that data ready. I had little to no access to agricultural workers due to a number of issues. Let's see. One, workers didn't want to talk to me or anybody. If you remember, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and I want to say 6 or 7 or 8 other law enforcement agencies did a pretty major raid in O'Neill last summer. It was, I was out trying to gather interviews at the time, and I didn't really put two and two together until a little bit later. Where someone that I was interviewing, someone that regularly interacts and talks to ag workers, and she's been doing this for about 5 or 6 years, and she told me also they won't talk to me either. This is someone that they should know and trust, and they won't talk to her because of some of these scares from the O'Neill raid. Some of the other issues were, one of the issues for me was time, right? I think some people can go right out in the field and do interviews immediately. It's not how I work. I like to gain some kind of relationship, even if it's just one day and then go the next day. And I really didn't have time to do those things. I tried everything to get interviews. I talked to my family and my friends in Scottsbluff. You know, hey, do you know any of these people? And some people would say, yeah, I heard this person. A couple people gave me phone numbers. And I would call, and either there would be no answer, or they just didn't want to talk to me. I even tried to reach out to, I call him my beef guy. Right? This is the guy at the farmer's market that I buy my grass-fed, non-GMO ground beef from. And he, hey, I hate to do this. He's someone I've talked to when I'm at the farmer's market. I said, hey, I hate to do this, but I'm trying to do this research, and do you know anybody? He sent me a name over email, and he said, she should be contacting you. That person never contacted me. So I really tried to beat the bushes to get someone to talk to. I actually had an interview set up, right? One of the barriers, not to jump ahead too far, but one of the barriers is that people don't work up, like quote, business hours. They don't work 9 to 5. So I had this interview set up for, I want to say 7 o'clock on a Thursday night. I don't know exactly what night it is. And so, I get my interview clothes on, right? It's in the summer, so it's hot, so I take my shorts off and I put jeans on, kind of dressed how I am right now. And I go and knock on his door, and he said, oh, my brother-in-law actually set the interview up. Took me over there and introduced me to the guy a couple days before. And so he said, didn't Vince, but my brother-in-law's Vince, didn't Vince tell you? I texted him. He had to cut a field of hay that night. So he was late getting home. He was home when I got there, but he had just gotten home, and he was exhausted because he had worked, 10 or 12 hours that day. And so he said, I can't do the interview tonight. I said, okay, some other time. And then, I wouldn't say he didn't answer the phone, but he didn't answer the phone after that. I don't want to say it that way, like he was trying to avoid me. He probably didn't know. If it's me, if it's a strange number, I'm not going to answer. Anyway, I never got a hold of him again. If that interview had been even in Schuyler, or maybe even Lexington, which is 3 hours drive from here, I could have gone and visited his house. But I'm not going to go all the way to Scottsbluff to try to visit one person to try to do this interview, right? It's still possible that I could get this interview. This is actually an interview I really wanted because, as I said, my brother-in-law and I went over to his house a couple nights before, and I was talking about the research that I'm doing. Part of the problem with the research is it's hypothetical. I'm talking to an ag worker and I say, if you ran into these problems, what would keep you from going to Legal Aid of Nebraska? Well, he actually had something that happened. He said about 18 months before, he wasn't paid for this month of work. So I was excited because it's not even hypothetical for this guy, right? Anyway, the interview never happened. Again, that's part of the difficulty of gathering and getting interviews for this project for me. So on to the research, right? What's happening? So what type of, I want to start off with, and this comes from people that I interviewed. These aren't things that I just thought of myself. And there's probably more of them, right? You see I have the comma and the ... because when I was preparing these slides, I thought, well, I'll think of more of them. And then I just left. I didn't leave it there accidentally. I just thought, well, there's other things. But these are some of the things that could happen to people. Unpaid work or wage theft. It's not always theft in terms of people that I talk to. And the people that I talked to, the 9 that I talked to were, what we call community advocates. Some of it was, they said, just misunderstanding. In terms of the person said they would pay this, and the worker thought something different. But nonetheless, people aren't paid for their work, or what's oftentimes called wage theft. Some of it was deliberate theft. I read a story yesterday about this family and this guy. It was 2 men, and they had worked for this farmer for like a month, and he paid him with a check that had void written in the corner, right? But they didn't realize it till you get a check. I'm not going to examine the check, right, they didn't realize it until they went to cash the check that it said void on the check. So that wasn't a misunderstanding. He was deliberately not paying that. Right? So that's one of the things that happened. Harassment, sexual harassment, but also harassment in general. People being called names on the job, people being referred to with derogatory ethnic and racial names, non-citizen kind of stuff. I won't give you any of those words. You can imagine what they are. So, divorce, child custody, marriage kinds of issues, including domestic abuse, right? Filing protection orders, that kind of thing. Evictions, also related to housing, health concerns, dangerous work conditions. And again, it's estimated that 60% of the farm workers are not documented, which means legal aid wouldn't be able to file cases for them. And talking to legal aid lawyers, they said, we can talk to anybody. So anybody can come in, and they don't ask, it's not the first thing they ask is, do you make this amount of money, and are you, do you have papers to be here? They can talk to people, they can recommend things, but they can't file cases for undocumented workers, and that 60% is quite a large number. The barriers that keep, so the two biggest ones were trust and lack of knowledge, right? That keep, in terms of barriers that keep agricultural workers from accessing free legal aid. There's at least this perception that legal aid, that nothing to do with legal aid, but for immigrants, that no one's really going to look out for these individuals, right? That nobody's going to really do anything for them, and that's part of the trust issue. It could also be lack of knowledge, but I start off with the trust. This is one of the biggest ones, and this has a number of layers to it, right? One of the things that came up is these people might have been previously taken advantage of by people that call themselves lawyers, or there's people in the community that say, I'm not a lawyer, but I'll fill this paperwork out for you for X amount of dollars. And sometimes they do it very well. One person that I interviewed, they had paid a woman in the community, and this person was not a lawyer, but they had paid her $10,000 over a number of years, and she filled out the paperwork for them correctly, and they got a green card and eventually citizenship based on the paperwork that she filled out for them, right? But that doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes people take the money and run, so to speak. So one of the barriers was just not really trusting the system, which comes up again. Right? Another thing with the trust was fear of retaliation, afraid of the boss. What they're talking about here, and most people when they bring this up, or I should say an example, is detasselers. Detasselers, mostly in the central part of the state, Kearney, Grand Island, that area, they work as a team, and if one person's gone, then they're short a person. They have to finish so many fields before they get paid. So that was one of the things they said, the other workers are going to find out about it. The boss might find out. They're afraid of losing their job. A number of these workers are H-2A visa holders, right? Which means they're guest workers. They're here for 8 or 9 months. And they're afraid that if they complain about anything, let alone legal stuff, that their visa's not going to be renewed the next year. And, I can't say for sure one way or the other, but they're probably right? They work at the generosity. They're hard workers and they're low paid. But they work at the will of the farmer or whoever's bringing them in. So retaliation by bosses, by contract laborers, by fellow employees was also one of the big fears and one of the big barriers relating back to trust. Still with trust, right, the workers think the information will get shared with the government. So one of the things that I'll get to is I'll wait for that. But this has to do with immigration status. Now this is true in general, according to what I was told, not just for people that don't have papers, but also people that are here with papers, right? Because they just don't know. And we see a lot of this happening in today's political climate, that people that have the right to be here are being, at the very least, hassled, and at the worst, sometimes deported or thrown in jail, even though they have the papers to be here because of this, that, or the other thing. It just reminds me of this situation. It happened a few months ago, but these women just filed a lawsuit. It was in Montana, and these two women were speaking Spanish, and they were detained for, I want to say 45 minutes by an ICE agent. He just happened to be in this quick shop, and they're speaking Spanish, and they said, what did we do? And he said, well, you spoke Spanish. There's not very many people around here that speak Spanish, right? They were not only both citizens, they were both born in the U.S. One was born in El Paso, the other one was born in Southern California. I would say he arrested them. He took them outside, and they couldn't leave for he questioned them for 45 minutes, right? So they weren't technically ever under arrest, but if you've dealt with law enforcement, you can say, can I go now? And they'll say no, right? What are you going to do? So again, sometimes people have the right to be here, and they're still hassled for whatever reason, right? They're scared of who they might be talking to, right? This is a quote from one of my community advocates in Scottsbluff. She says, trust is huge in the Latino community. Relating to the intake system of Legal Aid of Nebraska, right? The first thing that you do, and the way that they do intake, is over the phone. So my understanding is if you go into a legal aid office, they will give you the 800 number, and you're going to have to call the 800 number for them to take your information to see if you're eligible, and then they'll assign you to a lawyer after that. So the intake system was problematic in and of itself, right? In terms of trust. You can see that these are, TS is me, but you can see that these are 3 different people. I just used their initials here, and this was, straight from the transcripts. And so the first person, let's see, this was the top person was Scottsbluff, this next person was Schuyler, and this person was Lincoln and Hastings, right? So she said it's really personal. You're giving a lot of personal information on the phone to somebody that you don't even know. You don't know them, you can't see them, you don't know where they are. I know I'm leery about anything with the phone, right? Because there's so much scams and things going on, so people don't trust them there. So then I asked this next person, how do you think people would approach this because they have to go over the phone? And she says, by the way, they were all women except for one of the people that I interviewed. I think they would be scared too because they don't know who they're talking to, They're afraid that they might not understand you. So it wasn't just the trust, it was that my English is not that good, and I don't know if this person's going to be able to understand me over the phone. I can totally relate to that, because while I do speak Spanish, it's not that good. And it's much easier to speak in person when you can see the person's lips moving, and you can ask them to repeat things, and they can enunciate. My Spanish over the phone, I would avoid it whenever I could, and these people are avoiding it too. So this last person, I said, okay, do you have people that call you, it's difficult, that call you, but it's difficult to talk to over the phone, right? This person works for a nonprofit. She doesn't work for legal aid, but she works for a nonprofit that does a lot of outreach with migrants, emergency funding for hotels, food, those kinds of things. It's an organization called Proteus. And she says, yes, I never talk to people over the phone. I asked her if she spoke Spanish, and she said no. But she knows enough Spanish. She's been doing this for 8 years. So she said, I know enough Spanish. I know the phrases and the words that I need to know. And so you can see here, I say pretty good in Spanish, but I'll meet you at this date and time in person. And I did that the past 2 summers. So even this person who is not from legal aid does not like to talk to people over the phone. She gets that people don't want to do this. Especially, again, you can imagine you're in some kind of trouble, you're having some kind of issue, you think that you might need legal representation. The last thing you want to do is go over some line with someone that you don't trust, right? On the other hand, this was someone in Scottsbluff, talked about, we were talking about the intake system on the phone, and she said, yes, there's problems with it, but in terms of the vast areas of the state and location and transportation, it can be a good thing. So the phone intake system was mostly derided, but a number of people said, in Nebraska and some of these wide open places, again, living in Omaha, it's hard to imagine. I'm from Scottsbluff, so I know and I can imagine. But even Scottsbluff, the area is 30,000 people, right? You go up to Cherry County, Arnold County has 276 people. So these are very, very desolate areas. And this is where a lot of these farm workers live, right? Because that's where the farms are, that's where the ranches are. So the phone intake system had some pluses and some negatives in terms of being a barrier, right? The second really large kind of group of issues has to do with lack of knowledge. They're not aware of or they don't know about the program. And I'm saying Legal Aid of Nebraska, the Immigrant Legal Center used to be Justice for Our Neighbors, right? We really did this research with Legal Aid of Nebraska in mind, but we expanded, and they knew we were going to do this to to ask if people got free civil legal advice from any agency, including the Immigration Legal Center, who is, they are opening a Scottsbluff branch. I'm not sure if it's open yet, but they're expanding it outside of Omaha, right? So again, lack of knowledge. They don't know that the program exists. They don't know it's free. They think that they'll have to pay. And again, these are tied into those issues of trust with, you know, I paid this other person, sometimes even a lawyer. Sometimes it's not just a community person, but I paid the lawyer this much money, and they ran off with it, and so now I don't really want to do that again, and they don't know that it's possibly free for them to use legal aid, right? I ran into this a couple of times. There's an impression, and we know that perception is reality, that legal aid doesn't help immigrants. This is what some people in the community think and why they wouldn't go to legal aid. I'm an immigrant, they don't help immigrants. Now again, from what I've talked to the legal aid people here in Nebraska, that's not true. As long as you have papers, they can help you, including filing cases for people. But again, if you think they're not going to be able to help you, you're not going to call them. Okay. Still, with lack of knowledge and things that they don't know. I use the term ignorant. A lot of people think that's a dirty word, but it means you just don't know about things, right? They just don't, they're not aware. So they don't know that they can do something about the situation. It might not even be that they're so much against legal aid or against lawyers, those kinds of things. They just don't think that they have, like this guy that I was going to interview that lost a month's wages. When I told him, I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I think the statute of limitations is 2 years. So I gave him legal aid information. I said, if it's 18 months ago, you might still be able to do something about it. And he gave me this look like, I'm not going to do anything about it, right? So they just think that they don't have a problem that they can do anything about, or that they need a lawyer for. They just don't know their rights. And see, this next point, they're not familiar with the U.S. legal system, whether they're immigrants or not. Originally, I put in there, who is familiar with the U.S. legal system, right? I have a PhD, and I'm not very familiar with it. I don't know some of these ins and outs. And so I wouldn't expect someone who's not familiar with U.S. culture and has low levels of formal education to be familiar. If my guess would be, there's a few people in here probably that I'm wrong about, but most of us are not familiar with some of these things, right? And in general, they have a negative attitude about the legal system in general. A number of the people that I talked to spoke specifically about Mexican immigrants and the legal system in Mexico and what people are familiar with there, and so they think that that same kind of system carries over into the United States. So that's part of where that negative attitude comes from. So some of the other barriers, and you can see I'm still in the middle of coding and analyzing the data, but these are some of the other barriers. Language came up, and language seemed to be more of an area thing. So the people in Omaha, when I asked them about language, at least with Spanish and English, they said they didn't think that was a problem because there's enough Spanish speakers at Legal Immigrant Center and at Legal Aid of Nebraska. Now they did say specifically, if you're talking about Nuer, or I can't remember the other languages, if you're looking at, increasingly these agricultural workers are Sudanese and Somalis, and there's where there might be some language issues because there's not speakers of those languages as much as there is Spanish language. Again, time, they don't have time to contact a lawyer. I said this before, but they don't keep business hours, meaning they don't work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. A number of these community advocates say that legal aid needs to have hours that aren't 9 to 5. They need to be open on Saturday, maybe even Sunday, and they need to be open in the evening. I know that a lot of the outreach that they do is done in the evening and on the weekends. But whether they have availability in terms of their offices at those times, I don't really know. I'm not really sure. Still with various cultural issues, right? This kind of idea of I can take care of myself. I run into this a little bit with people that think immigrants come here so they can get welfare, right? And there's two responses. I always have that. First of all, if you don't have papers, you're not eligible for welfare, right? Any kind of welfare, whatever, welfare in quotation marks. And secondly, most people, and the literature points this out, most research that I've done in the past, a lot of it has to do with immigrants. They don't want a handout. you know what, I can take care of myself. I don't want free anything. I want to pay my own way, and so that becomes a barrier also. It was mentioned by some people in Schuyler that maybe a woman's husband wouldn't let them go out. And so this has to do, again, back to divorce, custody disputes, domestic abuse, those kind of things. They don't want to complain for all the reasons of trust and because they don't want to get fired. And mostly they just don't want to complain. Most of us don't. Most of us don't want to complain. A lot of us things will happen to us in our daily life, and we just swallow and we put up with it and go, oh well, that person's a jerk, or whatever we say, right? So most of us don't want to complain. And then finally, this one, it's kind of humorous, but it's true. The legal and legal aid turns people off. And someone said, people do not like lawyers. So a couple of the legal aid people were supposed to be here today. I'm kind of glad they're not. Right? People don't like lawyers, and this is true. One of the people that I interviewed was a lawyer for legal aid, and she talked about how she dressed when she did outreach, saying, I dress, for her, she's a lawyer, she dresses down. She probably dresses about like I dress, right? But for her, that was dressing down. The other person, the woman from Proteus, so they do outreach together. Migrant Education, Proteus, the Nebraska Department of Labor, and Legal Aid of Nebraska. And she said, I tell the legal aid people, don't wear any t-shirts, don't wear anything that has legal in it, right? Because you can see the connotation, especially if your English isn't that great. But even if your English is good, legal anything, I don't want to have anything to do with it. I don't want to talk to those people. So what is to be done? Outreach, right? And legal aid does a lot of this. I went on a journey with a couple of their interns, both Spanish speaking, and we went and they do other kinds of outreach. They go to county fairs and they set up tables and those kinds of things. But this was going knocking on doors outreach. So there's an H-2A visa program. These are agricultural guest workers, and you can find out where the people are supposed to live online. It's not very easy to find. I could never find it, but legal aid told me that it's available, right? So they have the addresses of those people, and they go knock on the door, and they hand out literature, and they say, we're just here getting out literature, letting you know about our program. It was quite interesting to me. You know, there's a number of places near Columbus. We went to places in the state where I've never been before, so that was interesting to me. In and around Columbus. I remember it was about 8:30, and they were going to go to, it was a little town about 20 miles from Columbus. Columbus is about an hour and a half drive from here, and I'm doing the math, right? I'm figuring out how much time, like 8:30. We're not going to get back to Columbus until 10. I'm not going to get home until 11:30. It's going to be almost midnight by the time I get home. So anyway, I went with them. We drove out to this house, and nobody was there, and it didn't look like anybody lived there. That's why I say you can get an address where they supposedly live. But they do this kind of outreach and other kinds of outreach. And then really, I think, based on what the woman from Proteus said, Proteus started doing this outreach about 4 or 5 years ago, and now people know her, and now people trust her. They call her for problems and issues. And I think and I hope that legal aid just has to, you know, buy its time and do more outreach and get more people to know them, and eventually the program will be kind of filled out. Questions? Yeah, Laura.
Early in the presentation, you talked about ag workers being exempt from certain requirements like minimum wage and so forth. And you talked about the power of the agricultural lobby. I feel like I have to say that I'm not a historian, but my layperson's understanding of what happened with the New Deal also has to do with the fact that a lot of agricultural workers were non-white at the time.
Oh yeah,
oh yeah. Kind of, so it was basically a racist component to who was exempted from rules about working conditions and so on. And I mean, you could say that that kind of lives on in the sense that a lot of agricultural workers still are not white, yeah. Although the demographics have changed. But I just wonder if you could say something.
Yeah, no. I mean, you kind of already said it. That's really the unspoken underlying issue that happened in 1935 when the Wagner Act was passed. It was seen a lot of not just non-white, but specifically people from Mexico that they wanted to exempt. And today, I asked everybody this question, are these workers Latinos? And they said most of them, not all of them, but most of them. Are they immigrants? Again, they said most of them are immigrants. It was interesting because one of the houses that we visited, and I had heard this from a couple of different people, they were on the H-2A visa program, and they were South Africans. They were white South Africans, and I was told by the intern, it wasn't on the visit that I went to, but on a different visit. He's much darker than I am, and they kind of hassled him a little bit, and they apparently had this flag in their apartment that was a apartheid era flag. So some issues there. I've also, now one person in western Nebraska said no, one person said yes, but Native Americans closer to the border of South Dakota working on ranches, working with cattle and horses. And that's not surprising looking at the history of Native Americans with rodeo and those kinds of things. But I think it was prejudicial and racist then, and I think part of that still carries on today, as you said. Yeah. I think there's a connection between the two.
LSC you talked about in the first half of the talk, how does that red line out of the government, is that part of HHS or?
No, I don't know. I don't know where that funding comes from. I don't know. I originally thought it was a publicly funded private corporation like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Right.
But it's not, it's a nonprofit. My guess is that it's similar to that, but it's officially a nonprofit. But I don't know exactly where the funding comes from in terms of which department. Do you know, Christian? I was actually, I lied about the legal aid people not being here to see that people don't like lawyers. I was hoping they'd be here because they would probably be able to answer a question like that. Yeah?
I have sort of this question. I know that, or I'm sure that sociologists do participant observation and ethnography and so forth, but what you're saying almost makes me think that the sociologists need to make a case for like sociological sites, though, with archaeological digs and so forth, so you have to be there, right? Like, we need to work on getting funding for this is our base camp in western Nebraska, so that the research doesn't take all this driving from Omaha all the time.
Yeah.
And specifically put it into the archaeological site, but you all are the ones in the field, so you kind of know what how all the source of funding.
Yeah, I was lucky enough that when I went there, I had a place to stay and other people that I could visit, because driving 7 hours to do one interview and then driving home. I had an interview one time that was scheduled in Lexington, and I had class that morning, and I calculated out that I could leave out. No, actually, someone else was going to have to take my class. This was last semester, and if I left at 6 in the morning, I could make it there by 9, do the interview at 10, leave at I think 11 to be back when I had to take care of my kids at 2:30. That person canceled, and I was kind of happy that person canceled, because I didn't want to. After I thought about it, I'm going to drive 6 hours for a 40-minute interview. I could do it on Zoom. Other questions?
You spoke about the definition of agricultural worker being broader than you thought, and I was wondering, for example, in Louisiana, there are a lot of Vietnamese people shrimping and working with seafood, and so would they, do you think
Yes, I
fall under the
do
definition?
think so, yeah. Looking at ag economies in different parts of the country, North Carolina has a lot of shellfish.
Right.
And so from what I've read, yeah, they would absolutely be included. Again, the one that was a surprise to me, I'm from Scottsbluff, and I didn't know that this trout farm existed. But a couple of people said, oh yeah, there's this trout farm. It's out by Harrisburg. Don't worry if you've never heard of Harrisburg. I'm not really positive where it is, even though it's only 20 miles from Nebraska. But it's out there. Yeah. But absolutely, in Louisiana, shrimpers, people, my guess is that they would be included, because the seafood industry is mostly included in that. Yeah,
The definition that legal aid gave us was you can talk to anyone, or as ag workers consider anyone who is working in the agriculture big sector, except for people that work on meat packing industry.
Yeah,
Those are the only ones that they are not allowed to talk to.
yeah.
So if they have a civil problem, they cannot be serviced by legal service.
And that's because meat processors have their own rules and laws. I don't know that it was any deliberate attempt to exclude them, but they have other avenues, ideally. Yeah. But again, I was told that less than 50 people, that they could talk to those people. Yeah.
Some of the legal issues that the workers had were like domestic, they weren't related to their employment, right? I mean, you said divorce, custody,
Yeah,
but the
yeah.
employers were just not willing to give time off for that. I mean, are they just
yeah.
unconcerned about they're just
Yeah.
unconcerned about the supply of
That's-
labor, they're not with more people?
That's what I was led to believe. One of the people gave an example of some like community classes that I know what they were citizenship classes. And they were in the evening, and the employer would not let them off for a couple of hours once a week. They attend the citizenship classes. And this person called someone who called the boss, and eventually out of the kindness of his heart, he said, okay, I'll let you go for these citizenship classes. But yeah, even though it's not directly related to the work, that's the impression that I got, that they now, I didn't talk to any of the employers, right? So I don't know if that's true, but that's the impression, that's the perception that people have anyway, that they're not going to let me go, and then it goes back to that, I don't want to cause trouble. If you cause it, I mean, there's a number of people out there that are going to do this work, so if you cause trouble, one person's gone, they bring someone else in.
In your research, did you want to do an interview for the employers, or were you just focused on the?
We were focused on the workers and the community advocates themselves. I came up one time interviewing, I asked something about interviewing farmers, and they just said, it's not our demographic, it's not who we're looking for. Amongst other things, farmers most likely, despite the bad agriculture economy, they're not going to make the income requirement. They make more than 125% of poverty. But I did think about it, especially with my again, his name's Luke, but my beef guy. I thought, oh, this person, and I know him because I've talked to him extensively. Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked him to help me out with the research. And I thought, oh, I could ask this guy, and I think I called Legal Aid, and they said not really who we're interested in.
A UNO grad, I'm going to say 2010, went on to get his JD from Creighton and was working the immigration hotline for legal aid. And it seems to me that they minimized it or got rid of it. Do you know what's the status? Is there an immigration hotline?
Well, that's the phone intake system. There's a hotline, and it still exists. It used to be associated with another. No, actually, it used to be associated with Legal Aid of Nebraska. They've now moved it to the
ILC,
yes, what is it?
Immigration.
Immigration Legal
Oh, okay.
Center.
And it's
Yeah.
publicly funded.
Yes.
They
They moved it to the Immigration Legal Center because legal aid does, most of what they do is not immigration. And most of what this other organization, formerly J-Fund, does is immigration, so they moved it to that organization. Yeah. They do have,
It's not 24 hour.
I think it is, but
Is it?
I don't know. I think
Maybe
it is,
you
but
can
I'm
find a
not
message.
positive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other
I'll
questions?
stick around if anybody has any questions, but thanks for coming. I know it's really cold out there, so I appreciate everybody coming here, and see you soon.
Thanks, man.
That was great, Tomas. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks for coming.